I am Alida Liberman. I am an associate professor of philosophy here at SMU and a CTE fellow for the fall. And the session today is strategies for encouraging student reading. And I have 3 goals for the session, and these are all on your handout. Encouraging us to empathetically inhabit the perspective of a student facing a challenging reading, modeling a student reading reflection assignment that I've used in my classes that people could potentially modify for their own courses. And then if we have time, which we may not, practicing methods of engagement with a reading to spark collaborative conversation about how to encourage student engagement with difficult texts. So I think we're all familiar with the problem, and the problem is that students aren't doing the readings. We've all had the experience of, asking a question and you think, and nobody says anything. You think, well, maybe I just need to reframe it. And so you reframe it and still nobody says anything. And finally you realize it's because nobody has done the reading and class isn't going the way you want it to go. And how do we respond to this challenge? I think we want to approach it in 3 different ways at the same time. The first is increasing students' intrinsic motivation to read by doing things like choosing readings that make sense for your students and your class, addressing any motivational or psychological barriers that they might have to reading. We also, I think, can't rely fully on intrinsic motivation. So we want to address the extrinsic motivation to read as well with graded assignments. And finally, sometimes no matter how much we do those first 2 things, they still won't read. So we can think about, how do you have a productive class session anyway if students haven't read? So I'm going to look at these in order, and I'm going to model for you an exercise that I always do with my classes every semester, especially my intro level classes, which is aimed at alleviating a potential barrier to intrinsic motivation for reading. And so I assign a paper that is discipline specific, How to Read Philosophy by David Concepcion. I have the students read this as part of their homework for the second day of class. And then we review some of the points in the paper. And then near the end of that lesson, I do this activity with them. And I say, there's a couple of passages that we're going to look at. And can I have a volunteer to read the first one? So can I have a volunteer to read passage 1 for us? You might need a mic.
Okay. Finally, the Cowboys found a spark. Prescott connected with Bryant for 21 yards, then came right back to the wide out on a 40-yard bomb down the left sidelines to get Dallas in the end zone. When Dallas finally forced Green Bay to punt and then added a 33-yard field goal on its next possession, pulling to within 21-13 at the half, there was a new life in the stadium. But Rodgers and the Packers got the ball to start the 3rd quarter, and they marched right down the field in just 6 plays. After the quarterback connected with the tight end Jared Cook, who was all alone in the back right corner of the end zone, Dallas was looking at a 15-point hole. They gave it their all, but in the end, Aaron Rodgers just proved to be too much, as the Packers eventually won the NFC divisional round game 34-31, a field goal with only 3 seconds remaining, the difference.
Thank you. Raise your hand if you were 100% sure what everything in this passage was about. This audience of faculty is different from the typical audience of SMU undergrads. What if you're like 75% sure, 50% sure? You can kind of follow most of it. You know what sport it's about, but maybe not much beyond that. Generally, in a room of SMU undergrads, there's maybe 30 to 50% of the students raise their hand like, yes, I understand 100% of this. Almost everybody gets a good 75% or more. You'll sometimes have 1 or 2 who say that they don't really understand it, but usually every single person in the room knows what it's about. So my question for you all, and the question I ask my students after we read this together is, what is this about?
It's about football.
It's about football. So like American football or like football?
No, American football for sure.
How do you know that?
Because in soccer, the real football, we don't have yards and tight ends and those kinds of things.
So it's the positions. Okay. So who is this game between?
Dallas and the Packers or something?
Who are the Packers? Where are they from? Green Bay. So Dallas is not the Packers. Dallas is the Cowboys.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. And was this an important game?
Divisional NFC divisional round game.
Seems to be. How do we know this? Is this a good score? Like, is this like golf where your scores are usually pretty low? Is it like soccer? You know, real football where like 34-31 would be really high.
Awesome.
Is it like basketball where that would be really low scoring? Like, what's it? Was this a high scoring game, a low scoring game? What do you think?
Medium high, I would say.
How do you know this?
Because I think really high blowouts are in the 40s, 50s.
Okay.
Usually not higher than that.
Okay. And do you see what I'm doing? I'm pretending, and I don't have to pretend very much because I really don't know a lot about football, but I pretend to know absolutely zero about football. And sometimes this can go on for quite a long time. Like I'll ask the students who's playing, and they're like, the Cowboys. How do you know the Cowboys are from Dallas? It doesn't actually say Dallas and Cowboys together, right? It's assuming tons and tons and tons of background knowledge. And so I say to the students, why is this easy to read? And they'll say things like, because I play football, or I watch football every week, or I remember watching this particular game, or, you know, I grew up and football was really big where I'm from. When I taught in Indiana, I used basketball. And when I taught in Canada, I used hockey. I try to pick the sport that's most popular. And so I say, okay, great. That passage was easy for you. It was hard for me because I didn't have the background knowledge, but it was easy for you because you do have the background knowledge. Could I have somebody now read passage 2 for us?
I'll read because the microphone is close to me. For the first time in the series, West Indies batted on the opening morning of a test. For the second time in the series, Craig Brathwaite fell short of a century. And for the third time in the series, Australia went to stumps on day 1 on top, this time with West Indies a 6 for 207. Nathan Lyon led the attack with 2 wickets on a challenging day for the West Indies batsmen, who had to sit through 2 lengthy rain delays. Despite the wet weather, Australia had no trouble over rates. Lyon set down 32 and Steve O'Keefe raced through 14, meaning that only 15 were lost to the rain.
Okay. Raise your hand if you are 100% sure what everything in that passage was about. Usually in a typical SMU class, there's either 0 or maybe 1, maybe 2, but usually 0 people who raise their hand at this point. What if you're pretty sure? Does anybody not even?
Yeah, I
Yes,
think it's cricket.
cricket.
Yeah, because it's like it probably is multiple days. I know that Australian people like cricket.
Yeah,
Have something
so
to do.
usually the students can guess that it's cricket, but not much beyond that. Every so often, I'll have somebody whose eyes light up because they're a cricket fan, and then they get a chance to actually explain cricket to their classmates. But this doesn't often happen, right? And so, what is this about? Is this well? Let me instead of asking you what it's about, I'll ask, was this harder than passage 1?
It was hard even for me to read it.
Yeah. Why? What made it hard?
Because there's no context. Doesn't make sense to me. I feel like it's easier to read if I have any idea what it's about.
Yeah.
Even the names were hard. Craig Brathwaite, like that's not a very unusual name. Yeah.
Good. Why else was this hard? Why was this harder than the first passage?
Know your expressions. Short of a century, with overrated.
Yeah, overrated, short of a century, right? There's a ton of terminology that you don't know. Why don't you know that?
We don't have exposure to it. Have never had exposure.
Cricket is becoming more popular in Texas, right? But it's still not popular enough that the average SMU student knows the rules of cricket. And so you're lacking background knowledge. And so passage 2 is almost impossibly hard. Passage 1 is easy, but it's not because you suddenly got stupider. And I put that in quotes to say I'm not endorsing using that word, but it's a word students will sometimes use to describe themselves. It's not because you got less skilled at reading between passage 1 and 2. It's not because passage 2 is objectively written in a more complex way. They're both from the sports pages of major sort of average tier newspapers. They're written with the same sort of grade level, the same kind of sentence structure, the same level of complexity. They're even written with the same amount of terminology. You know what a 40-yard bomb is, you know, or you might, right? You know what a quarterback is, you know what the end zone is, you know what the tight end is. But if you've never encountered American football before, it's going to be as incomprehensible as the cricket passage. And so the goal of this is to emphasize that two passages with the same sort of difficulty level can really show us how the role of background knowledge is crucial for reading comprehension. And the secondary goal here is not just to encourage students to think about what background knowledge am I missing and how can I fill it in, but to encourage them to not be discouraged when they get difficult readings. Because I'll tell them, you know, this reading you have for this class, this piece of philosophy, is assuming a lot of background knowledge. And if you're struggling, it's not because you're bad at philosophy necessarily, it's because you don't have that background knowledge. So how can we work to fit that in? And then also on this day, I talk about growth versus fixed mindsets, this idea that when that all skills are improvable, including intellectual skills. And when you encounter challenges, the way to respond is to improve. And the idea is that hopefully this can help students feel less anxious about what their own lack of comprehension means about them. Because I find that a lot of SMU students are very invested in their identities as good students, right? Especially in your first year, you've come from high school, you've been high achieving, you get to college, the work is harder, it is more complicated, you lack the background knowledge, and you have this experience of thinking, well, I guess I'm just not good at this. And that can be very demotivating and make people stop trying. So I try throughout the semester then to ask at the beginning of class, and students don't usually answer me, but I try to get them to say, what background knowledge were you missing from the reading that you did last time? And sometimes they'll say like, oh, they used this word and I didn't know it. And I'll say, you know, when you pick up a text, it's like you've shown up at the dining hall halfway through a group meal and you only know one person at the table and they all have a bunch of different mutual friends and they've been talking for 30 minutes about some story with their mutual friends. You can't follow that conversation. The reason you can't follow the conversation isn't that it's an especially hard conversation or you don't speak the language. It's that it's relying on all this stuff you're not familiar with, right? The people you don't know what happened beforehand. And so if you feel disoriented when you're reading, it's because you're thrust into the middle of the conversation without the background knowledge. Thoughts or questions about this exercise or this idea of background knowledge?
My question is, how early in the semester, what is the timeline when you do this exercise with the students?
So I do this on the second day.
Okay.
So day one is like the intro stuff and review the course stuff. And then day two, I'm doing this. I'm doing stuff about growth versus fixed mindsets and some like intro terminology stuff usually.
I was going to say in world languages, we do these types of activities before a reading in order to activate background knowledge.
Oh, that's
where we
great.
give them terminology, culture, and brief history that the students would see reflected in the article they read. And that helps them a lot comprehend a text in a new language about a different culture with new words. So that's
awesome.
Strategy.
Yeah. Any other questions or thoughts, conversation topics? We can be very flexible with what we talk about today, of course. So the other component of intrinsic motivation, and we can talk as much or little about this as you like, is what readings are we choosing? Are we choosing readings that are misaligned with either our students' current abilities, with the goals of our course, or with what we actually want the goals of our course to be? And I think there is no one size fits all answer to any of this. Sometimes people will ask me things like, how many primary sources do you think we should be assigning versus secondary sources? And my answer to any question like that is always, it depends, right? What are your learning goals? What is the point of that class? So for my intro ethics classes, for example, at some point after maybe my third year of teaching, I stopped assigning the primary source of Kant for the categorical imperative and for basic ethics, because it's just so difficult. And my goal for that section of the course was get them to understand this core philosophical theory that they can then apply. I don't really care that much if they know how to draw out the nuances of that from that text. It wasn't worth the effort that it took to engage with such a super challenging text. There's other texts that are difficult, but that I keep because they play different roles. So I have them read selections from Mill's utilitarianism as the primary source, even though it also can be challenging. One, because I think his writing is very beautiful, even though the students don't agree with me. And I want to expose them to nice philosophical prose. But two, more importantly, because one of the things that we're doing at that point in the semester is talking about objections and replies to arguments. How do you respond to an objection to an argument? And I have them read together in class sections where Mill is raising objections against his own view, and we're trying to trace how this works and how authors are having debates with themselves in philosophy. And so for that, it is helpful to read the primary source, because engaging with the primary source is doing something that just giving them the core content isn't doing. And I found that it's easy for me, at least, to be unreflective about it and to sort of think like, well, of course they have to read all the primary sources, or of course they have to read all these canonical things. And maybe they do for your classes, but maybe they don't. So I want to encourage us to think about, what are you choosing? What is the level of difficulty? Are they missing background knowledge? Could you fill it in like you do for world languages? Is what you care about the content, the reading process, or both? And if you say you care about the reading process, why and what else in your class actually supports that? If you say one of your course goals is getting students to learn how to read complex primary texts, and then you expect them to do it at home, and then they come in and you just lecture about the content and test them on the content, that's not connected in any way. So either you have to change your course to actually support that goal, or you have to reconsider whether that really is a valuable goal. Do you sometimes want to be assigning popular articles, podcasts, fiction? I've started sometimes assigning the, like if there's a academic journal version of an argument, and then there's a shorter Aeon magazine version of an argument from the same author, sometimes I'll assign the shorter, easier one if what I care about is the content and the engagement. So those are the sorts of questions I ask when thinking about this. Thoughts, comments, questions, pushback.
Sometimes I feel that we need to have the student to read that Kant piece. That without that Kant piece, they just won't really understand. I mean, they'll get the idea of what a categorical imperative is without it, but you haven't read the Kant piece. How do we still get them to read that? Do we just wait until a later class, or when they have that background knowledge already built up a little bit? Or what is the solution? Because I feel sometimes they're hard readings that we should still be expecting our students to do in order for their research to be sound and their papers to make sense.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I would turn the question back to you, which would be, I think there definitely are times when we should be expecting students to do hard readings for a variety of reasons, not least of which it's valuable to struggle, right? It's valuable to have to work hard at something. And I think especially with the rise of large language models and AI, students are doing this less and less, right? I had a conversation with a student recently where I was trying to discourage her from turning everything in with Grammarly. And she said, well, I've been using it for so long all through high school that I don't know that I can really write at all without it anymore. And I see that there are good reasons to get students engaged in the struggle. But what you said was interesting. You said they need to read the primary source to make sure that their research papers are good. Well, it depends on your class. My students aren't writing research papers about Kant, right? They're writing papers where they're trying to apply Kantian theories to everyday ethical decisions. And reading Kant, frankly, isn't going to help them with that because it's so incomprehensible. What's going to help them with that is reading high quality secondary sources, raising objections to his view and drawing out the implications of his view, right? Reading the text isn't going to help them with that paper. If I wanted them to do historical exegesis, then they have to read the text in order to write that paper. But I would encourage you to you said, they have to read it, but why? Why do they have to read it is the question. That's the hard question we have to ask ourselves.
I don't have a good answer, but I still feel that something is lost in that lack of struggle. Like we can, become a YouTube university where we're like, just watch this on YouTube, a TikTok, you got it. But I don't think that they're going to actually get it better than some of the harder stuff that requires a lot more thinking, a lot more time. And that's something that I think many of our courses are very rushed and pressed for time, where we just can't have that. And maybe we need to wait until they're at the higher level and they know better what they're reading. They can dedicate a whole course to whatever reading, and then that makes more sense there.
I mean, I completely agree we should be going slower, and I don't do that myself, right? It's there's so much you're trying to cram in. I have a colleague at another university who reads, I think, 4 articles all semester with his undergrad, first year intro philosophy students, because what he really values is that slow, we're going to work through a couple pages at a time in class, even with the intro level students. That's not what I'm doing in my class. I absolutely don't think we want the TikTok YouTube university, right? But I don't think that every class and every assignment needs to have the difficult reading in order to have a good experience, because I think it depends on what the goals are.
Thanks. Well, we're on the section of what readings are we choosing. To me, this is a really hard issue because all my classes draw diverse students, and any reading I choose will either be too low level and boring to some of the more advanced students, or too high level and incomprehensible to some of the students who struggle. And so finding a reading that fits everyone is always really tough. And, for better or worse, I'm one of the people who spoon feeds the stuff in the lectures and ends up letting students get away with taking good notes in my lectures, reading the lecture notes that I've posted. I often have videos talking through things, and they can pass my classes without having done very much of the reading. If I were to try to pick readings and make them all do it, finding the one size fits all reading, I don't have to do that the way I currently approach most of these issues, but I'm not sure how to do it if I were. So I guess I'll admit I came here with the main question in my mind being, should I do more to force my students to do the readings? And I'm not sure what the answer to that question is.
So I'm really glad you said that, because I think one thing I haven't mentioned is that we're all assuming that it's very important that they do the readings, and that should be something we talk about, right? Is it actually very important that they do the readings, or that they do which readings? And it sounds like maybe in some cases it's not, and in some cases it is. And again, it's always going to depend on what the goals are. And if your goal is to get them to understand certain concepts and apply them to an interesting puzzle or to their lives, then the reading may actually be less important. And this isn't to say that that should be everybody's goal, right? But this question, I think you're never going to find something that is going to be one size fits all, right? That's impossible. Like one size clothing doesn't fit all, right? It never is actually going to fit all. But maybe what you can do is try to vary it. Like you have some readings are gonna resonate with some students and not with others, or are gonna be too difficult or too easy for some and not others. So one option is to try to vary it a bit more. Like instead of, I don't think anybody in the philosophy department does this, but instead of say just assigning one textbook and all you read is that same textbook from that same person, like you're assigning a mix of textbook style or primary source or different medium, right? Sometimes you can have really good philosophy being done in podcasts or YouTube videos or something. And connected to this, I think, is the idea that I don't think students usually take me up on this, but I post the Kant textbook summary, and I do post the original text, and I label it optional for the philosophically hardcore, and say, like, please do this if you want to. And if you, every so often, you get a really keen student who like wants to read it and talk about it. It's rare, but it can be easier to give the option of extra than to expect everyone to do the really challenging thing and figure out how to scale it back. The other thing I've done sometimes is when I post the Mill primary source, I'll also post a textbook summary and say the textbook summary is the optional supplement. And if you're really struggling with the primary source, you should also read this other thing. But it's difficult. Any other thoughts about this? Questions? We can come back to this. We could talk about the next point, which is extrinsic motivation to do the reading. I think that if you don't incentivize reading, no matter how well chosen your readings are, no matter how growth mindset your students are, it's sometimes just not going to happen, right? We need external motivation sometimes. And the best way to get this, I think, is some kind of graded assignment, connecting the reading to grades in some way. There's so many different ways people can do this successfully. A lot of people really like a software like Perusal, which is an annotation software. You can do group annotation. I haven't used that myself personally, but I know a lot of people who really get a lot of value out of it. You can do structured reading questions. You can do less structured reading reflections. The one thing that I think is important for extrinsic motivation reading homework is that I think it should always be graded for completion rather than for accuracy. And there's room for disagreement here, right? Some people think the best thing to do is give a simple reading quiz with easy questions and they pass it or they don't. But what I switched this because when I first started teaching, and I wasn't here, I was at the University of Indianapolis, and I gave students reading homework, and it was graded for accuracy, and it was due before class started. And if they said the wrong thing about what the author said, they didn't get the points. And if they said the right thing, they got the points. And I pretty quickly realized that the students I was teaching were not as success ready, for a way to put it, than the students I had taught when I was a grad student. And they were doing the reading, or at least they were looking at the words on the page, but they weren't understanding it well enough to answer the questions. And what happens if you're a first year undergrad and you actually read the thing, you completely misunderstand it, you do a reading quiz and you still get a 0 or, a C, you're not going to bother reading. What's the point? Right? It's going to be extremely demotivating. And so my goal was to shift to graded on completion because I want students to be reading anyway, even if they're not getting it. I want them to be able to get the same full credit for grappling with it, for looking up the words they don't know, for trying to do the reading, even when they misunderstand it. And so the second handout I have, which I don't have to review in detail, you can look at it later and I can send anybody who wants a digital copy, is the reading reflection assignment that I give my students, where pre-COVID, I had them do a lot more of these. Post-COVID, because in part of the burnout of them and myself, I on average have them do one a week for a two times a week class, but you could do more or less. It's due before class starts, and they're just engaging with the text in 3 different ways total from this long list of engagements. That includes comprehension, things like identifying the thesis, asking questions, whether that's missing background information, whether that's clarification, curiosity, or critical questions, making connections, raising criticisms, what I call epiphanies. Did you change your mind about something? Did you have a realization? How did the reading make you feel and why? Which I think is something philosophers in particular don't like to pay attention to, but can be very important. Sometimes students will say, this reading made me so angry. Okay, well, think about it. Were you angry because you think the author is saying something false about an important topic? That's valuable information. Or are you angry because it's difficult, right? That tells you different information. And then I let them creatively engage with it if they want. Every semester, I'll have one student who, really likes drawing and likes to illustrate it or likes to make memes or something like that. And so it's worked pretty well. It is harder in the era of ChatGPT than it used to be, because I require that students, even if they don't quote directly, in order to get credit, that they put specific page numbers from the version of the text that we're using, which makes it a little bit more difficult for them to just say, give me 3 responses to Mill on utilitarianism. They have to at least be looking at the pages and connecting them, but it doesn't completely solve the problem, but I think it does help it. And I find that this has been useful because it's also useful for me. If I'm just grading for completion, it's pretty fast and easy to grade, right? You don't have to take the time to decide, is this a full credit answer? Is it not? If a student has completely misunderstood the reading, you can just write in a comment saying, that's not actually what the author says. We'll talk about it in class. And then you don't have to spend your time, correcting them. And if students are all misunderstanding the same thing, if you make them do early enough that you can look at it before class, you can come into class then knowing what they are concerned about. It has sometimes helped when students are really quiet and really hesitant to participate. I can say, I never am remembering like which person said which thing, but I can say, some of you raised this really good criticism in your reading reflections. You said blah, blah, blah. right? And so you can kind of draw in what they're saying and then hopefully open it up so that maybe the person who said that realizes, oh, the teacher thinks this is a good idea. It's actually worth talking about. Or I'll sometimes say, if you can grade them early enough, you can say, hey, that's a good point. I hope you bring this up in class. So I've found this format to work pretty well for me. Students have mixed reactions to it. Every semester on my evals, I get some people saying it's way too much work. They don't like it. Some people saying they love it. I will often have one or two people saying, I wish you required this for more of the readings because it like forces me to actually do it and I have a better class. And I'll always tell them, you know, you could still do it. Like, you don't have to only do the reading when I'm assessing it or only do this kind of engagement. I have a Canvas assignment for all of these and then Canvas drops a bunch, but you can do more than the assigned if you want. They tend not to do that. But I think that there are lots of ways to do extrinsic motivation. Some small percentage of the grade being dependent on engaging with the reading, ideally in a way that is graded for completion, is the summary. Thoughts and questions about extrinsic motivation for reading?
Give me 1 second so I can unmute you, Eric. Okay, go ahead.
Hello?
Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to mention, I'm a perusal guy. I'm kind of a new perusal guy. I'm doing it for my second semester. And just to kind of weigh in on it, I'm pretty happy with how it addresses this particular issue of getting students to engage with the reading, because I can see them engaging. I can see them, posing questions, responding to, so of course, you're getting into the text and you're attaching comments or questions to specific locations in the text, and they comment on each other's comments and respond to each other's questions. And there's a nice tutorial at the beginning that kind of shows them how to get a high score. Now it is scoring them. It's a small percentage of the grade. I want to say it's like 4% or something in my class. And it's not completion because it is assessing what they do, but it certainly isn't assessing them for correctness. It's assessing them for something like their degree of engagement with the material. And it doesn't simply respond to lots of comments. It can somehow, and I think it does this, I don't really understand how, distinguish between trivial, poor, low quality comments and higher quality comments.
It does it automatically.
It scores it completely automatically. And I did it last semester and I had no complaints from students about the scores. And it just seems to somehow, you can adjust the scoring criteria. There are many different parameters that you can choose from. So for me, it's kind of so far so good with perusal in terms of addressing this very issue. I can see that they did, at least some substantial part of the reading and responded to it in some kind of engaged way. So that's just something I'll throw out there.
Thank you.
Super, that's great. And I should say that it's interesting that there's this lack of like this black box algorithm or something, this lack of transparency with how perusal is grading it. It's probably like their proprietary algorithm.
No.
But I would consider if it's grading on quantity and style of engagement, then that is meeting that goal of not grading on accuracy. So that I'm assuming that a student who tried to understand it, didn't understand it, but still wrote a bunch and like was asking sensible questions could still get the full credit.
Absolutely.
Based on perusal. Yeah.
It isn't scoring for accuracy at all. It's somehow assessing engagement, right? And in particular, how they engage with other students' comments and so forth. So it seems reasonable in that respect. Yeah.
Other thoughts?
So the sort of assignment or activity that I've had the best luck with for getting students to really grapple with readings is breaking them into groups, having them sit together with assigned questions where they needed to delve into the readings and find the answers to the questions. Often in philosophy, so reconstructing arguments that and counter arguments that are present within the readings. and having them do it together as a group and to have it be an activity. But it ends up spending quite a bit of time, and not all of the topics that I teach do I have articles that are really well suited to this sort of activity. And I wouldn't have time to do that on all the topics that I want to get through a semester. So it's not really a solution that would generalize to make them do the reading every week. But it does help build some of the skills that we hope they'll end up having for delving into readings and making sense of readings. So I've had decent luck with that, and I'm not sure whether I ought to expand to do more activities like that or something, but it's something that's worked for me at least.
And I think that's great because it brings in this social element of it, this element of accountability to their classmates, because the person who doesn't read knows that they're going to be useless in doing the group activity tomorrow, and that their group mates might resent them. And, you know, the person who reads really well and understands it really well is going to be a really valuable group member. So I think it's really good when you can get that element of social accountability too. That's great. Let's think then about the third prong of attack, which is, okay, what do we do when they still haven't read? How do we have productive class sessions anyway, given that sometimes they just still won't have done the reading? And so I think there's different ways we could approach this. I want to know what everybody thinks about this. And then depending on what people are interested in, we can either just talk about this and brainstorm together and vent frustrations and ask questions together, or we can practice one of these methods. So maybe, I mean, the challenging thing is it's really difficult to avoid the scenario where you assign the reading, you know, most of them aren't doing it. And so then in class, you clearly and thoroughly explain every idea from the reading. And then that's pretty demotivating for the students from doing the reading, because why are you going to read? Like, sometimes when I go to a conference that's pre-read and I know that the author is just going to read their whole paper at the conference, I don't bother pre-reading it, because I think, why would I do this? Versus if I go to a conference where it's pre-read and the author's only going to give a 5 to 10 minute overview and then everybody's going to talk about it, I think, okay, I really better pre-read this, right? You know, I need to be ready. So I think it's really challenging to figure out how to navigate this. We can think about things like asking questions that could be answered, or addressing topics that can be, you know, relevant topics that can be discussed without having done the reading. But people who have done the reading have more thorough background about it. Maybe you can present some key information in alternate ways. You know, they've read Mill or Kant, but then you also show the YouTube summary of it. You know, the 5-minute video in class. Maybe you illustrate an idea with a new example. Maybe you want to do some in-class reading exercises. If there are passages that I really want the students to read, I print them out on the handout. I can use handouts instead of PowerPoints, and have them sit down and read it together, either in groups to then talk about it, in pairs, or sometimes with this method called Think Aloud, where you read the passage out loud and you stop to narrate your thoughts on it out loud in real time as you go. So I use this method in my classes sometimes, where if there's something that I think is really essential, I just bring the reading into the classroom, so it's unavoidable. None of these are perfect solutions. I think they all have their drawbacks, but I'm curious what y'all think about, what do we do when you're in class and they still haven't read?
Go ahead, Eric.
Hey, Alida, could you say a little bit more about that think out loud thing again? That sounded really interesting, and I'm just wondering, when students are reading,
Yeah,
and
so I'll
what do
model
they
it.
say? What do
Actually.
they
So
do?
I got this idea from a philosopher at Elon University, who's I've worked with through the American Association of Philosophy Teachers, called Stephen Block-Schulman, and he has a paper where he talks about this, and I've included on the handout links to examples of an undergrad and one of his colleagues doing this think aloud method that were from his paper. But basically what you do is you are, and the way I explain it to students is primarily modeling it, which is why I'm going to model it right now. So the way you do it is you read through the passage, and then if there's anything that makes you pause or makes you stop, or you have a question about, you just say that out loud. You're doing a meta narrative about your thoughts while you're reading. So on the third page of the handout, I have a paper that is in a recently published book called The Art of Teaching Philosophy, called What to Do When Students Don't Do Course Readings.
Mhm.
And this is the first section of that short paper. So I'm going to read the first paragraph in the think aloud method, and then if anybody else wants to try it, they're welcome to. This scenario is probably familiar to most college teachers. Okay, so this isn't K-12. I wonder if what this author is going to say is specific to college or if it could apply more broadly. You ask your class a specific, simple question. Okay, so the author is me in this case, of course. So the question is specific and simple. So that makes me think that it's not just any question we're thinking about. It's questions that should be easy to answer. About the content of an assigned reading. No one volunteers an answer. Well, I wonder why they're not volunteering an answer. Sometimes students can be shy. Maybe that's it. You ask a more open-ended question about the general theme of the reading. Still crickets. Oh, crickets. It's like when, nobody's saying anything. That's a metaphor. It soon becomes clear that your students aren't just shy, but unprepared. They haven't done the reading. Well, this reminds me of my class this week when this happened to me and students hadn't done the reading. What can you do to prevent this? That's a good question. That's why we're having this event today. And what can you do in the moment when it happens? To address this question, we first need to identify why student failure to read is a problem. Okay, well, that makes sense because there's lots of different reasons why it might be problematic, and I can think of a bunch of them. So do you see what I'm doing? I'm narrating my thoughts about the reading as I go, and I'm saying way more than the average undergrad will when reading this. The average undergrad is usually stopping to ask, to mention a word they don't know, or to say, this makes me think of something from another class or something else from this class. And there's two ways you can do this. You can do this where one person is reading in front of the whole class. I tend not to do that. I have them in pairs. The class gets pretty loud, but I have them in pairs read the passages out loud to each other. So like person one reads through the passage. I always do this with Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail. And I tend to do this with passages where I really want the text to be the focus. And so person one will do the think aloud, then for text one, and then we'll talk about it all together. And then person two will do the think aloud for quote two. And I find that the students tend to like it. I think that I really highlight that it is, a new skill. I say I'm teaching, we're practicing a new skill. It's going to feel awkward. Let's kind of lean into the awkwardness together. It's going to feel weird for all of us. I'll stand up here and show you what it looks like, but do your best in your pairs. And then because they're just doing it silently in pairs and I can't hear what anybody's saying because there's 30 people all talking together in pairs at the same time, I think that it makes them feel less anxious because they're not reading in front of everybody. Does that answer the question of what this looks like?
Yeah.
I think it's a great strategy because what you want to do is vary the style of delivery and vary the activities that you have in class. Doesn't mean that you're going to be doing the, thinking out loud every single reading for every single passage, but I think to mix it in, maybe it could be really helpful for a particular student. They find out, well, this is a strategy that works for me. So they would do that more often when they're studying.
I was going to mention another strategy that's worked fairly well for me, which I think is maybe the text version of what you're doing here, where I will give them an annotated version of the readings, where sometimes I'll just copy paste out an electronic reading and insert my own comments in line with it in brackets, or sometimes I'll give them the reading with my comments added as boxes to the side pointing to different portions of the text, but offering a lot of the same sorts of reactions that you're offering, reading it out loud. And it helps to solve one of these problems that I was mentioning earlier about trying to find a size that fits all the students, where I'll have some of the students who would struggle reading the main text and will mostly read my annotations where I sort of summarized the main points and brought it out, and other students who kind of could get the main text, but they're helped by my summaries, have them there when they need them. And so it helps to produce something that has enough content meeting them at different levels that it works out pretty well. But it takes a lot of work to prepare that for each reading. And so I don't do it for all of them, but perhaps I should.
Well, I think you could do something like that as an in-class exercise too, right? You could have students collectively make those kinds of annotations on a passage together for, participation credit or whatever in class. Yeah. When are we end? Soon, right?
Okay, so I think he's accustomed to not having people coming in because we don't have every single time before his class, we have a reservation. So that's why they came in like the classes.
The last thing I'll note is something that is a challenge for me ongoing, which is the next paragraph in this intro from my paper is that I think it's difficult not to take it personally sometimes when students don't read, but that it can help to try not to take it personally. So one reason students not reading is a problem is that it makes you frustrated, sad, angry, demoralized, or disrespected. And these emotions, I think, are sometimes fitting. It can be appropriate to feel disappointed if class doesn't go well because students are unprepared. Sometimes they're not fitting. Maybe students fail to read for reasons that have nothing to do with you, right? They're working many hours a week to pay bills. They have family or caregiving duties. A lot of time to a sport or extracurricular. They're overburdened this semester. They're having a mental health issue. They're triaging what's most important, and they know you're going to give them the material and lecture and somebody else won't. And so I try my best to just give them the benefit of the doubt and not assume anything about why they haven't read and try not to take it personally. And to step away from that sense of insults that it can be easy to feel when students are not engaging with the material that you gave them. We're probably out of time.
I would say we can always continue the conversation in the lobby over there, but yeah, but thank you.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks,
Thank you, Eric.
Justin. Thanks, Addie.